우라 영접들아 즉
Kim Il-sung was a dictator of North Korea from its foundation in 1948 to his death in 1994. Like many of his contemporaries, he left a long-lasting legacy, although none was as direct and internationally relevant as his own. Kim was born on the 15th of April 1912. Meanwhile, the Titanic was sinking. He shared the same birthday with such great people as Leonardo da Vinci, Emma Watson, and me. Strangely enough, his family was Presbyterian, apparently, and more importantly, his family were not particularly keen on the Japanese, and tended to engage in anti-Japanese activities such as protesting, debating, probably, and also leaving Korea to go to Manchuria in 1920, which was a really good idea, up until the Japanese invaded Manchuria in 1931. But before we get ahead of ourselves, in 1926 Kim founded what he called the Down with Imperialism Union, which is commonly celebrated as the foundation of the Workers' Party of Korea. While you might say it's a bit of a tenuous connection, the guy was 14 when he made this. Before you go feeling terrible about having done nothing with your life, please do bear in mind that this organisation didn't really do anything of note. Anyway, by 1930 he was a little bit of a filthy communist and got himself arrested for subversive activities, which in 1930s China really just meant sharing your pizza. When he got out, he started hanging around with anti-Japanese guerrilla groups around Manchuria, which is quite pessimistic considering that the Japanese hadn't even invaded yet. And then one day, someone decided to blow up a Manchurian-Japanese railway line. The Japanese blames it on the Chinese, which kind of made sense when you think about it in fairness to them. I mean, the only people that really knew what happened there were the few people that were actually there trying to blow the thing up, and where was it? Again? Yeah, China. It would have been a bit unreasonable to have blamed the Dutch for this, but not that unreasonable. In any case, one thing led to another, and the Japanese found themselves invading Manchuria, and those guerrilla groups from earlier suddenly made a lot of sense. Kim Il-sung then started fighting, and was actually pretty good at what he did, rising quickly in the ranks as a leader. Some guy called Wei Cheng-min turned him from a little bit of a dirty communist into a big bit of a dirty communist. At one point, the Japanese caught someone who they thought was Kim's wife and threatened to kill her if they didn't surrender, but didn't, so they killed her. No one's quite sure if it actually was his wife, so that happened. At some point, the Japanese chased Kim Il-sung and his soldiers across the Soviet border into the evil empire, a lawless land of hatred and misery. Seeing soldiers cross their border into the Siberian wasteland, the Soviets brought them into the Red Army and kept them in a camp for some time, where Kim Jong-il was born, depending on the ask, and he'll become important later. He also had another son there, but he wasn't important because he drowned in a lake. Kim Il-sung did actually fight for the Red Army, but who cares? There's somewhat of a problem presented to historians researching his early career, because he was actually quite competent, and the records at the time were sketchy at best. It is very difficult to tell the difference between genuine praise of the man and propaganda, and as a result, depending on how you interpret his career, he was either an earth-walking god, or a man who was good at leading on the power of others. When World War II was ending, the Soviet Union decided to declare war on Japan just to see what would happen, and what happened was that they were able to occupy about half of Korea. When the war ended, Stalin requested recommendations for communist leaders to rule the zone, and Kim's name came up. And so he was installed the dictator of North Korea. Well, actually, there's this guy called General Shchikov, a Russian guy who kind of led the occupation for a long time. He pretty much ran the show for the first few years. His power greatly reduced when they actually did set up the DPRK in 1948, but he still held quite a lot of power, and he kept it up until the Chinese turned up. Well, no, the Chinese hadn't actually turned up yet, but the North decided to see if it could replicate the success of the Chinese Civil War by invading the South, and it went very well up until the Americans turned up. Anyway, we'll get to that later. By the time Kim was given this position, he had spent pretty much his entire life in China, and didn't really know much Korean. For this reason, he had to take lessons in the language before he could do any kind of public speaking. Evidently the power got to his head, as by 1949 he was already referring to himself as the Great Leader, and started consolidating his power to an extent that none of his other contemporaries really did. This is probably why his legacy is still fucking going. They invaded the South, and it was going really well for them, up until the Americans came up and intervened. The war then started going really badly for them, so they called up Mao to see if they could have some military aid, and they said yes. It was actually going really well for the Americans until the Chinese turned up with their veteran army from the Chinese Civil War and it turned into a stalemate. The only real effects of the war was a demilitarized zone, incentive for a South Korean military build-up, and a wonky border. North Korea had barely kept itself alive through foreign intervention. This clear victory was marked by the construction of Kim Il-sung Square in Pyongyang, which is used almost exclusively for military parades, as indeed is the military itself. This time marked the beginning of further consolidation of power, yes, even more. And it was around this time that Kim started being a little evil. He came up with this thing called the Sungbun system, which was somewhat complex, but it's kind of like the Chinese social credit system, where the state gauges how much of a threat you are and started using it to imprison and persecute perceived dissidents. Concentration camps called
관리소
sprung up around the country. I could go on about the conditions of these camps, but they're worse than ass fish. They still exist. Look them up if you want to. Anyway, in 1955, he made a speech describing a new philosophy called Juche, described by anyone who cared as an original, brilliant, and revolutionary contribution to international and national thought. Although it probably wasn't that original, arguably wasn't that brilliant, and no one outside North Korea really cares. The word roughly translates to self-reliance, and states that a nation can somehow achieve true socialism by becoming self-reliant. If there are any economists watching as regards to the idea of self-reliance, you can laugh and like and subscribe now. If there are any communists watching as regards to the idea of a communist world split into independent, isolated nations, you can also laugh and like and subscribe. It could be described as a form of isolationist communism or as an excuse to neglect rural villages and allowing them to solve their own problems, which sounds like a very nice and efficient idea until you realise that their entire economy was centralised. The ideology was a sort of opposite to another Korean concept called
사대
which roughly translates to serving the great or the powerful, referring historically usually to the Chinese, more recently the Japanese, or right now the Russians. Pretty much anyone in the neighbourhood that was bigger than them. Where China had communism with Chinese characteristics, North Korea had Juche, which was sort of communism with Korean characteristics. The idea being that the basic Marxist vision for the future and how we'll end up with communism states that we started from feudalism and then that would develop instead into capitalism, which would lead to a socialist revolution, which would ultimately lead to communism. But Korea had jumped straight from feudalism to socialism, and thus this basic model was inadequate. There's also a little bit in there about how a great leader would be essential for the running of the country, and by this time he had entrenched himself so deep into the political system that he actually managed to get away with that. This whole personality cult idea, by the way, was based off the tendencies of the two most deadly dictators of all time, being Mao and particularly the man that got him into power, Stalin. Stalin died then, and Khrushchev came to power in the USSR and engaged in anti-Stalinism. Given that both Mao and Kim had been creating personality cults like Stalin, they too were subject to this process. Given that Kim Il-sung had literally rewritten communism so as to ideologically solidify his dictatorship, you can probably see how he might have been in a little bit of trouble here. He was summoned to Moscow to receive a dressing down from Khrushchev, whatever that means, and while he was gone, various opposition leaders and the Korean Central Committee devised a plan to heavily criticize and then depose him at the next meeting, with the backing of the Soviets. Kim heard of this news and, arguably rather reasonably, wasn't particularly happy about it. He played some 4D chess, delaying the next meeting by bribing everyone and setting the stage for the meeting. And finally, on the 30th of August, it took place. The opposition began to criticize Kim for his creation of a police state, focused on industrialization instead of feeding people, and a lot of other interesting stuff. But no one could fucking hear them because Kim's supporters kept on shouting through the speeches, rendering them inaudible. They then demanded that they should expel the leaders from the party, to which Kim calmly conceded that yes, they had a point. They did have some valid criticisms, and that, he might have been a little bit harsh, and promised that he would reform the country and make it more moderate. Over the course of the next few years, some opposition leaders fled to China, some were expelled, and then Kim decided to enact a little bit of a purge. In 1956, the other communist countries came along and asked them politely to stop the purge, and he actually did. It actually worked. But then the next year he started the purge again, and by 1958 the opposition was essentially dead. In 1959, more than 25% of the seats in the Supreme People's Assembly were empty because they had been purged. By 1961, there was only one faction, being that of Kim's. According to Kim Il-sung's biographer later, this was apparently the first time that no foreign armed forces were occupying the north. Did they bring guns into the parliament? While Mao and his personality cult couldn't really stand Khrushchev's de-Stalinization and had a wee bit of a split, the North Koreans somehow kept good relations with the Soviets despite objectively being worse at Stalinism than Stalin himself. In fact, this maintenance of good relations with the Soviets alienated the CCP somewhat, in addition to Kim's disapproval of Mao's Cultural Revolution. One of the main reasons, if not the biggest and only reason, that Kim wanted to maintain good relations with the Soviet Union was the same reason why for a long time the standard of living in the north was actually higher than it was in the south, and the same reason why Juche is quite an irony, and the same reason why they should have had this arrangement with the Chinese. The entire country's economy was based on Soviet subsidies. Given that copying other countries' military techniques for spreading communism everywhere worked so well last time, in the 1960s Kim decided to try some Vietnam-style guerrilla warfare after seeing how effective it was over there in Vietnam. This culminated in an event known as the Blue House Raid, or the January 21st incident. 31 elite soldiers were handpicked and ruthlessly exercised for about 2 years. They were to sneak over the border, make it to Seoul, sneak into the Blue House, and kill the president. The time came. They managed to make it over the border with little difficulty, and made their way slowly through the country. On the 19th of January, they set up camp in a place called Simbong Mountain. Hours later, 2 brothers accidentally discovered the camp and were captured. The hand-picked elite soldiers, trained to be merciless, cruel, and calculated, not letting a shred of evidence exist in their wake, decided to let them go after telling them the benefits of communism, and then let them go if they promised not to tell the police.
And DPRK content.
They immediately told the police. The South Korean authorities started searching for the intruders, but they were too fast, having specifically been trained to walk fast. No, I'm serious. 30 soldiers made it to the outskirts of Seoul, and very quickly realized that reports of communist soldiers in the mountains that seemed to be very mobile tends to make the authorities ramp up security to 11, and now they had no chance to execute their original plan. So they came up with a new one. They dressed up as South Korean soldiers and made it within 100 meters of the Blue House before being stopped by a policeman at a checkpoint. They couldn't bluff it, and instead opted to killing him. A big fight started, grenades were thrown, guns were shot, one guy was captured and then committed suicide, and in the end about 58 people were killed, including 28 of the 30 commandos, and not the president. He never tried that again. But the North Koreans did like to go around capturing foreign nationals, so at least they did that. Kim started developing a calcium deposit in the back of his neck which looked really big and ugly, so he got all the journalists to photograph and film him from a slight angle so it couldn't be seen, and as a result there aren't a lot of pictures of it. Most North Koreans, or most people really, didn't even know he had one. They made a new constitution in 1972 and he named his son the successor. Yay! Due to strange ideas such as, oh boy, communism makes things more efficient, and oh, you know what's more valuable than economic development? Self-sufficiency. North Korea started facing major economic difficulties right around the time the South began to liberalize and gain a higher standard of living and greater rate of economic development. Well, wow, this is all terrible. The only thing that could be worse is if the Soviet Union were to collapse along with all its puppet states. All those subsidies from the Soviets stopped, and no one would step in to replace them. What, did you think China would do that? Anyway, during the beginning of the 1980s, Kim Il-sung started handing over more and more control to Kim Jong-il to the point where, when this did actually happen, he was almost a ceremonial leader. He still refused to enact economic reforms, instead proclaiming the virtues of Juche and the like until the day he died. In his final days, he went a bit mad, going on about trying to adopt nuclear energy, and oh boy, that legacy did not last. He died in the same way that the man who had years ago enabled him died. A heart attack. A 10-day mourning period was declared, and Kim Jong-il became the new supreme leader, and there was immediately a famine. 4 years later, Kim Il-sung was declared the eternal president of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea by his son. That same year, the famine ended. Kim Il-sung died in 2011, replaced by the Kim Jong-un we all know and love today, and was given the title Eternal Leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in 2016, leading to the odd situation where the Wikipedia article for him used to say that he got his current position 5 years after his death. Due to Kim Il-sung's title of president of the Korea-ness, he's still considered to be in charge of the entire country. Just not alive or anything. So it's the only country in the world that is ruled by a dead man.
I do not consent to being in this video.